This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Hi, it's William B. Davis. I play the smoking man on The X-Files, and you're listening to the X-Cast.
Back everybody to the X-Cast. As ever, the truth is in here. I'm your host this week, Carl Sweeney, and thanks for joining me today for this episode in which I'm going to be discussing Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man from Season 4. And joining me to discuss this episode is none other than Darren Mooney. Hi, Darren.
Hello, how are things?
Yeah, pretty good. We've got an interesting one today, haven't we? This is a fun one.
We certainly do. It's standout episode of television. It's okay. I don't know if we're trying tipping our hand already, but yeah, this is regardless of whether you love or hate this one, it is certainly a memorable one, and very much I think one of those episodes that you don't forget, that you have an opinion on, one imagines, as opposed to some of the standard Monster of the Week stuff. This is an episode that I imagine most people can recall quite well and have very strong opinions about.
I think that's fair to say. Yeah, so this is Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man, like I said, the 7th episode of the season, which aired originally in November 1996, November 17th to be precise. An episode that was written by Glenn Morgan and directed by James Wong, in an interesting spin on their partnership. Normally they get the co-writing credit, don't we? But it's separate here. Wong's first episode as director of the series. And this, of course, is the episode in which, Frohickey recounts details apparently pertaining to the background of the cigarette-smoking man, who is covertly listening in on the discussion. Alrighty, Darren. So, overall, I guess we start with the number, don't we? And then we take it from there. So,
boil it down to a number and then expand out from that.
That's the idea. So, marks out of 10 for Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man, in your opinion?
This is a 10. This is an easy 10. This is an all-timer. This is possibly, in my top 10. And the great thing is, it's not even my favourite episode of the 4th season, which says a lot. But, no, this is a very, very highly regarded episode for me. This would neatly make my top 10. Probably even, top 6 or 7.
So, in a nutshell, then, obviously we'll pick through the individual elements as we go along, but what's so good about it?
Everything, Carl, is what's so good about it. No, it's an absolutely fascinating piece of television, in large part because it kind of boils down a large part of what I like about The X-Files as a show, what I think made The X-Files so successful as a show, and just larger things in general in terms of encapsulating a lot of the mood around the show in a broader cultural sense. It's an episode that, again, I was talking to somebody about this kind of offline in Meat Space, and we were discussing, she's a fan of The X-Files as well. We were talking about, the idea that, people... The X-Files is one of those shows where people remember becoming aware of TV writers through that, and being aware that different writers had different approaches, and that you could tell what episode belonged to which writer based on just the tone, its areas of interest, how it was about, what it was about, that sort of stuff. And the thing about the X-Files in particular in season 4 is the 4 episodes written by Morgan and Wong. Now, obviously, you have the Darren Morgan episodes from season 2 and 3 as well, but they were episodes that, when I was watching the show, really kind of clued me into this idea of television as an art form of itself. And now, obviously, that's very, sort of reductive of me. I was very young when I was doing this as a teenager watching it. But for me, they were episodes that really sort of showcased that, TV could be equivalent to cinema. And I don't just mean in terms of scale, because obviously the mythology episodes do that already, where you've got Mulder, jumping on top of trains and traveling to Hong Kong and riding on horses and stuff like that. I don't mean in that sense. I mean in terms of, as a vehicle for big ideas in inverted commas, and not necessarily big ideas in the way that you think of, Star Trek or The Twilight Zone even as big ideas, where they're moral plays. More like a way of examining and exploring contemporary American society, or contemporary society in general, pop culture in general, through the lens of what isn't quite allegory. It isn't quite like a one-for-one mapping to any individual thing, but instead a broad treatise and exploration. So what really resonates about Musings of the Cigarette-Smoking Man, to me at least watching it, is that it's an episode that touches on these huge ideas. And I mean, you can go big or you can go small with it. You can say on a small level, it's a really clever, like, subversion and exploration of the X-Files itself. It understands the formula, the rhythms, the routines of it, and it plays with those, and it very much exists in that context. And that's a perfectly valid reading of it, and I love that a lot about it. Or you can go big with Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. You can say, like, it's one of the great pieces of pop art of the 90s, I would argue, in terms of, like, film, television, music videos, that sort of stuff. Because it's very much, it's an episode that is about, and again, this is very reductive, because, I mean, obviously the X-Files in general is about these sort of things, but this episode, in particular, hones in on, like, the subjects of this idea of, like, history, and the role of the great man in history. And more than that, the idea of conspiracy theory, and narratives, and stories. It's got all these great, big, bubbling ideas running through this, and now obviously it's not the only episode of The X-Files that has that going on in it. And, like, this sounds really dismissive. It's like, this sounds like a version of the Great Wasteland speech, where I'm like, all of television apart from this is crap. That's not what I mean at all. I just mean, as a teenager watching it, this sort of, like, blew my mind to a certain extent. And it still does. This is something that feels, watching it, like it's at once I can't separate it from the X-Files, because of course I can't. It's Musings of the Cigarette Smoking Man, the Cigarette Smoking Man being an iconic X-Files character, but it's also something that speaks to me. I look at it and I think of the 90s in general. I mean, we're going to talk later on in a bit more depth about all this sort of stuff, but I look at this and I see, not just, season 4, episode 7. I see the evil twin of Forrest Gump meeting JFK. I see all these things that are simmering through, like, wider culture, bubbling to the surface. I see dealing with the legacy of JFK and the reality of Bill Clinton. And all of that happening in the space of a 45-minute episode that includes jokes about the Buffalo Bills never winning the Super Bowl. I absolutely adore it. And I mean, I can understand why some people would not like that. I can see why people would find it pretentious or annoying. I can see why people who have particular ideas of what the show could be would also be like, well, this is not those, and this is very up itself, or even it's very deconstructive or insulting to a certain extent. I can see those opinions of it as well. But to me, it's just breathtaking, and every time I watch it, which is remarkable for a piece of television. Sorry, that got very rambly.
No, that's fine. Whilst agreeing with a great deal of what you say, I'd only be an 8 out of 10 myself on this one. So what's holding it back for me, I guess, is the question. And honestly, I really do like it a lot. I mean, 8 out of 10, I think, is a really good score. The thing is, a couple of the things I'm going to say here, it's kind of baked into the episode. It's they're kind of redundant as criticisms. I'll flag that up front. So I sort of feel that this notion of the figure who intersects with a multitude of historical events, it is interesting. It is also fairly familiar. I mean, you mentioned Forrest Gump there, which is the classic example that comes to mind because this is an episode with a scene where the cigarette smoking man sits on the park bench and gives a life is like a box of chocolates speech. But I mean, you can also, you see that kind of thing in Woody Allen's Zelig, for example, and in a range of places, really. I think it's done very well, though, by Morgan and Wong here. What about this thing, the struggling writer? So the struggling writers writing stories about writers is quite a well-worn archetype too, and especially writers writing stories about struggling writers. And it sort of reminds me a bit of, you get these rock stars who they achieve a bit of success, and all of a sudden they're recording albums about how much of a pain it is being famous, and on one hand, there's kind of good Carl and there's bad Carl, and good Carl's thinking, this is really fascinating. There are autobiographical elements here pertaining to what's going on with Glenn Morgan, pertaining to Morgan and Wong's relationship with Chris Carter, about the X-Files itself. And then Bad Carl's kind of sat there sort of rubbing his fingers together like Steve Buscemi in Reservoir Dogs, playing the world's smallest violin for all the struggling writers out there, and perhaps feeling like he would have preferred something slightly more inventive in its place. Although what I do recognise is that maybe the familiarity or the roteness of these elements fits the overall themes of this episode very well, which when we come down to the story could just be Frohicke's kind of fevered exaggeration to a large part. So I don't know, I'm thinking about these things, or those were the things I was thinking about anyway when I'm sort of plucked 8 out of 10 out of the air,
No, I definitely can agree and empathise with some of those, but I would be more liable to, I'd say good Carl, feed good Carl. You've got two Carls fighting inside of you. Which one of them wins, Carl? It's the one you feed. But no, I would, I understand those, and I think you're right that you say they're baked into the episode, and to a certain extent, those are things that I almost like about it. So I like, for example, that it is very transparently doing that. And you pointed to, obviously, there's a huge genre of this idea of the great man of history, but the idea of, like, the figures who intersect with those. The entire TV show Quantum Leap is based around that concept. But within that, it's the fact that the episode is self-aware, which, again, I understand can be smug, self-satisfied, and really annoying if you're not into it. There's nothing more annoying than a party where somebody who thinks they're being clever is just getting on your nerves. And I can see this being very much that. But it's things like, say, taking the Forrest Gump speech. As you pointed out, delivering a speech about chocolates on a park bench with a homeless woman, rather than, with, like, somebody who's listening or enraptured on this idyllic sort of American street. That sort of spoke to me a little bit. And I can see why that would be a little bit smug, conceited, and self-aware, and wouldn't necessarily negate what you saw as the kind of functional problems of it. I also understand, again, what you were saying there about the sort of the aspect of writers writing about writers. And yes, that is very, very indulgent, and even beyond write what you know. But I mean, there is a sense for me that it kind of works because it plays with the larger themes of the episode, because those themes are very much about the idea of writing and narrative and storytelling and construction. And part of me also quite likes, and it's something that I think I like about the work of Morgan and Wong in particular on the X-Files, and obviously you can probably extend this to Darren Morgan as well as a writer, is that there is that element of, like, autobiography in that work where it all feels very personal and perhaps painfully so. And I know it's a cliche, the tortured writer who bears his soul on paper, and I understand that that's very grating, and I completely get the idea that, it is possibly a healthy, functioning artist without bearing your soul, without sort of, like, rending it onto paper, and sort of to be healthy, constructive, and to be kind of just generally happy and a good person and write material. I understand the idea of, like, the demanding, possibly stressed, on the verge of breakdown auteur who's struggling with this idea as, like, a romantic fantasy that doesn't necessarily help anybody. But at the same time, particularly with the Morgan and Wong stuff, and particularly in the 4th season, there's a strange vulnerability to it that gets me past, and I understand that criticism of, well, poor you. You are a writer on the most successful show on television. It must be so frickin' hard. But there is a part of me that gets past that, because there is something very honest in episodes like this, and I think particularly like Never Again later in the 4th season. And we probably don't want to get too much into the personal stuff, because I know that some of the personal stuff involving Glenn Morgan, if we're being entirely frank, is not necessarily flattering, and is not necessarily something that, is kind of something that is to be commended or encouraged. But I have a huge amount of empathy for somebody who, when they're going through something equivalent to the personal stuff that Glenn Morgan was going through when he was writing this, kind of bears that, if that makes sense. Even though I understand that, like, and again, we're kind of talking around it, but to be entirely frank, some of the stuff that was happening was not necessarily ideal for anybody involved in it, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense, and I know what you're saying, and I mean, just to go back to the 8 out of 10 thing, like I say, still very much admire this episode. And I sort of feel more comfortable giving him that score when we do think about Morgan and Wong's season 4 output as a whole, really, because I kind of feel that it's a quartet of episodes I really admire, and I also feel, in a funny sort of way, that quartet is greater than the sum of its parts, in the sense that I love Home. Home would be my 10 out of 10, I think. That's possibly my favourite episode of the entire series. Then Musings an 8, Never Again maybe an 8 or an 8.5, and The Field Where I Died is a really funny one to kind of score, maybe a 5. Fascinating, misfire, ambitious, but also some elements that just don't really work, I think. But what I love is the way that collectively sort of line them up one after the other, and it's a quartet that probes and interrogates the limits of what the X-Files is and what it could be in a very fascinating way. And yeah, I was going to sort of brush past this issue of personal expression. One thing it means, I think, is there are these instances through these episodes where you've got this apparent clash between the way characters act and the way they were previously constructed, and the way they'd be constructed going forward as well. So people have said this about Scully and Mulder in Never Again. People have issues with aspects of the characterization and the events that happen in The Field Where I Died, and it applies to the cigarette smoking man here, of course. And how do you see that? How do you account for it? Is it a problem? If not, why not?
this is the thing, and again, this is the thing where there's no right way to watch television or think about television. Every approach is valid, and whatever works for you as a viewer, because your own enjoyment of a thing as a viewer is paramount. There's no right way to do it. There's no wrong way to do it. There's nothing right or wrong about, not watching a TV show because you find a character's accent annoying or because you find that this aspect of the show doesn't work for you. But for me personally, I've never really been that much of a stickler in terms of things like continuity and canon, and particularly as they refer to long-running TV shows, in large part because of the production reality of long-term TV shows, particularly in the 90s where you're producing 24 episodes, where it's very much like get an idea down on paper, run with it, and hope that you have something at the end that is filmable, and while you're filming you have a week to do it, and you get that done, and then it's done and dusted, and maybe you can come back and do some post-production to fix it, but you're pretty much against the clock, you're working on a conveyor belt, and so I'm kind of sympathetic to the demands of that. I'm also one of those people, and again, I understand that this is not how everybody looks at the show, and this is entirely my way of doing it, but I've always kind of, I've liked the idea of the X-Files as this weird, kind of almost short story collection, or collection of, short stories, where there's a variety of different writers working on a variety of, different concepts, but using the same framework and using the same idea. And one of the things that really strikes me about, and again, this is to praise Carter as a showrunner, because we there's a lot of discussion about Carter. He's a very, ironically enough, the show's creator is a controversial figure, to a certain extent, in terms of criticism of the show and criticism of his work. But Carter as a showrunner, part of his strength for me was always, with Carter, the interesting thing is that there's a willingness to share his vision and to give space and to allow his writers and his directors to do what they want within that, to the point where you can recognize particular episodes and particular interpretations of characters as existing not as absolute objects of themselves within the show. So to bring it back, this quartet of episodes, and you're entirely right, it feels like something that exists completely different from the fourth season or even the X-Files as a whole. And I understand that that's jarring, and I completely get if people are upset or frustrated by that, and I can completely understand people are this is kind of ruining the illusion or sort of of continuity and this idea of a through line that you can trace through the show as a single object. But I have very little problem with that because I almost see them as a thing unto themselves. And it's entirely right, there's a whole host of continuity issues created here. In terms of things like Apocrypha, for example, it's very hard to reconcile sort of the teaser of that with anything that happens in here. And it's interesting that I think Morgan's gone on record and said that wasn't a deliberate choice on their part. They just wished that somebody had told them about it, because obviously they've been working on Space Above and Beyond when Apocrypha was written, filmed, and produced and that sort of stuff. But I don't mind it. It doesn't bother me that this doesn't necessarily neatly fit with everything else in the continuity of the show, because I think that it fits in terms of theme, in terms of archetypes, in terms of broad strokes and knowing what everything is. And it works as its own thing within that. I can stick this on and enjoy this as 45 minutes of television, and it's astounding and beautiful and one of my favourite 45 minutes of television, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think we'll return to some of those issues at the end of the podcast, probably. But I guess we should get into the episode more specifically. But before we do, we always have a look at the IMDb, don't we? So have you looked, Darren? Do you know what this got out of 10 from the fans who've judged it on IMDb?
All right, so I was on Herrenvolk earlier in the season. I know Herrenvolk got an 8.6, right? So by that logic, this should get a 9.8. But I know it's also polarizing. So I'm going to go with, I'm thinking this is maybe around, say, I'm going to give it a 0.2 bump, say 8.8 out of 10?
Actually, no, it's 9.2 out of 10
nice.
From 3,500 ratings. So how many episodes do you reckon are above this for season 4 on IMDb?
Oh, interesting. Okay, so in terms of 4... So, okay, first of all, Memento Mori is above this, right?
Actually, no, it's not.
What? Oh, okay. All right, then. Everything's to play for here. I'm going to say... If it's 9.2, I'm going to say there are 5 above it.
This is actually the highest rated season 4 episode on IMDb, which surprised me. I expected Memento Mori, Home, Paper Hearts possibly to be above it, but no, when I checked earlier, this was number 1. So I like to think there's a shadowy government operative who said, as long as I'm alive, this episode is the highest for season 4. But no, yeah, really good, 9.2. But yeah, Darren, I guess we should take a deeper look at Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. And the episode, of course, foregrounds its literary tendencies, I suppose, with this quote from Henry IV, for nothing can seem foul to those that win. I just love this teaser. I think the teaser is wonderfully evocative. You know, the rats, the soundscape, this setting they've got, this seemingly dilapidated building, the smoking man's trust no one lighter. You know, what actually happens, CSM sets up his listening gear, we hear Scully's voice and Mulder, and yeah, it's Ferreri is agitated, but he sort of teases us, he promises us that we'll know possibly everything about the cigarette smoking man. Of course, he's this omniscient figure, because there's this thing with the countermeasure filter. Ferreri won't speak until the CSM 25 is turned on, and CSM can disable it in an instant, of course. Yeah, what do you make of the teaser?
I really like the teaser, actually, and I really like the sort of atmosphere of it. It's the blues and the reds together. They're very striking. And particularly, like, again, rewatching the show on high definition, I've probably talked about this on far too many of these on these podcasts, but, like, rewatching the show since it's been remastered for high definition, it's absolutely beautiful. And again, you have that sort of rich sense of kind of colour that kind of seeps through it. It is very atmospheric, it's very evocative, and it's very telling that you immediately get this sense that's gonna run through the episode of the cigarette-smoking man as this figure who is alternatively, like, really powerful because he's sitting up there with a sniper rifle and the ability to listen into any conversation on Earth, no matter how many CSM 25 counterfilters you have. Love that, by the way. But no matter how much of that you have, he can still get you and get to you. But at the same time, there's this paradox of while he is that spectre, he is that boogeyman, he is the person in which Ferreri is panicked about. It's very clear that when Ferreri's panicking, he's panicking about the idea of the cigarette smoking man getting to him. He's still wandering around in these empty, dilapidated spaces, kicking away rats, smoking in darkness. You know, obviously nobody's at home missing him while he's doing this. He's spending his life in these strange spaces, you know, just listening like a ghost. He's watching, he's observing. Is he really partaking or participating? Does he have free will? And then you have that sort of theme that runs the episode, and I think the teaser kind of sets that up relatively well, that wonderful contrast. Yeah,
and another contrast that's set up immediately after the teaser is, you know, this link that runs through the episode of the personal drama alongside the historical drama. So we hear from Ferreri that on the same day that Leon Trotsky was assassinated, over in Louisiana, the cigarette smoking man was born. We get this backstory, don't we, about the smoking man's father, supposedly a communist activist. His mother died of lung cancer. With an interesting shot there of William B. Davis just inscrutable as the camera focuses on him. So I think Davis is really good in this episode, and it's fascinating when you stop to consider his attitude to the script when he received it, which is an interesting and amusing story. So in his memoir, Where There's Smoke, I believe it's called, he talks about how he was shocked when he saw the script because he felt it bore almost no relation to the character he had been playing up to that point. And he says, and I quote, "At the time, I would have been happy if Chris Carter had decided to pull the script altogether." Also fascinating, he discusses the challenge it poses to an actor to play a character. It's not only that his actions depart from prior episodes, but also there are these inconsistencies within this episode alone. You know, and it led him to this realization, he says, that in terms of filmic acting, all that matters is that each shot is truthful. And yeah, so he's really good, isn't he? He gets this nice opportunity here. He may not have liked the material at the time. He has sort of mellowed a bit, to be clear, actually, like, because there's an interview from Mania from around 2000 where he said, in retrospect, I like it better than I did. It was whimsical, fanciful, and yet kept asking real questions. So it's kind of interesting how that evolves. And I think that's arguably happened with, like, again, this episode and maybe the Morgan and Wong episodes in general in season 4, with the exception of Home, which was beloved at the time. Kind of interesting to have that sort of contrast between what he thought at the time and what he thinks now. Well, yeah, just a couple of pages later in his memoir, he does address that. He sat down to watch it again in 2010, he says, and now found it brilliant. He says, viewed for a postmodern or post-postmodern lens where truth is subjective, images are chaotic, and nothing is predictable, the show is spectacularly successful. And he also refers to the episode's inherent lack of substance, which is kind of what we've perhaps alluded to. Yeah, so we get part 1 of the episode. So we get these chapter headings, don't we? Again, on the literary theme. So part 1 is things really did go well in Dealey Plaza which is set in 1962, and enter Chris Owens.
Yeah, and astounding. And he's really great as well, actually, almost immediately from the outset. It's very telling that, like... And again, we'll probably talk a little bit later on about the awkward reception to Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man within 1013 itself, because that's a separate, like, chapter heading within this podcast that we're doing. But, I mean, it's telling that Chris Owens is the part of that stuck around. That Chris Owens was the part where, you know, even when you had people who were working on the episode being, well, I'm not really sure about this, it was like, yeah, he's a keeper. Because he really is. He's great. Yeah,
so just to be clear, I'm sure most people listening will know, but Chris Owens, of course, he'll reprise this role of young CSM in Demons, for instance. He'll also play the Great Mutato in Postmodern Prometheus. And then Jeffrey Spender, of course, in Season 5 and beyond. So, yeah, an interesting little...
career arc.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, there were rumours at the time that he was being brought in possibly as a replacement for Duchovny around the end of Season 5 during contract negotiations. I don't know how true those are.
So, yeah, CSM... At this point, he's not the CSM yet, actually. He's the non-cigarette smoking man. So he's reading The Manchurian Candidate. So this episode's chock full of cinematic or literary allusions, I think it's fair to say. We see young Bill Mulder. And then there's this scene, isn't there, where he's called in to be given his classified mission. And we get a lot of the interesting thematic stuff in this exchange, I would suggest. So Smoking Man's explicit in disavowing his father, isn't he? And I think that's interesting in light of the themes that are played with in this series.
Yeah, across the run of the X-Files, there's this question of, like, how do you define yourself in terms of your identity, and is it relative to your father? And again, this is the paradox of the episode, where it's, again, the idea that Mulder has to constantly choose between who is and who isn't his father. And again, you have that idea sort of coming into play, already seated in Talitha Kumi, that maybe Bill Mulder isn't actually Fox Mulder's biological father. And if that's the case, the absent father, how does that shape and define Mulder? And that sort of stuff that runs through it. And there is something very interesting as well in, like, that little monologue that Frohike gives explaining, like, the relationship between the CSM and his parents, or the cigarette smoking and his parents, where you have, like, this idea that his father was an ardent communist. And so you have the cigarette smoking man enlisting in the army and becoming, again, you have this litany of things that he, inverted commas, didn't do in service of the US government.
Yeah.
And you have this kind of dramatic irony of the fact that, like, he's defined himself in opposition to his father, to this idea of who his father was. And the irony there being that even if you are doing that, even if you are denying your father in a very literal sense, you are still shaped by that father, even in the absence of that. The paradox that, like, no choice that he made could have been, like, completely independent or completely free, because even though he's chosen not to follow in his father's footsteps, that is a direct result of the choices that his father made, rather than the choices that he made, if that makes sense. And you sort of have that push and pull between it. Because you have this coming in the middle of a monologue from the general about extraordinary men.
Yeah.
Which kind of is a recurring theme of, like, the episode. And it's something that kind of the episode plays with in terms of history. It's this idea of, like, great men. I think it's Thomas Carlyle argued that, like, the history is nothing but the biography of great men. The idea that, like, people have the capacity of will to shape the world to their reckoning. And there's this weird kind of motif that runs through this where it's wondering, like, is the entire second half of the 20th century the fever dreams of the cigarette-smoking man? Is he the great man in the shadows? Because obviously over the course of this he does a number of, like, hugely impactful things that shape American identity and culture. So if the American century had, like, a shape or a personality, would it be the CSM? And again, like, later on Morgan directly compares it to Forrest Gump. But even here you have this idea of him intersecting with history in a variety of ways and shaping and moulding it. But you have that contrast between the idea that he has this huge outsized impact while still being completely shaped by forces outside of his own control. Like, I mean, even then, like, his mother died of lung cancer, and yet he ends up a smoker. Like, there's a sequence, as Frohike explains, his mother died of lung cancer, and he's puffing on a cigarette, and I think he drops one at that point, but he just takes out another one in a moment later. So you have this kind of weird irony of, like, this man who has so much power, yet is completely powerless.
You mentioned the smoking, like, motif that runs through this episode. This thing where he's constantly giving up and so on. It kind of reminds me a little of, like, in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, in the first 15 minutes, where River Phoenix acquires all the sort of Indiana Jones trademarks in one run. I felt it was maybe slightly over insistent on that point, to be honest. But yeah, it's interesting, this scene though. The briefing, so there's the reference to classified, compartmentalized, which is a nod to Space Above and Beyond. The way the scene's set up also reminds me of the scene with Harrison Ford in Apocalypse Now, giving Martin Sheen the mission. And the task, ultimately, of course, is to assassinate JFK in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah, so what do you make of... I think it comes up in one of the comments I'm going to read later, perhaps, but this issue of using real events, and we shouldn't forget that these are real people that were killed or that were involved with, e.g., the Kennedy assassination. I mean, I'm not saying it's distasteful, but perhaps some people have said that. Do you have any qualms about it?
It's interesting because it gets at this idea of, like, and again, this is the idea of narrative and history, and whether there's a distinction between the two. And I like to be like particular about this idea of the assassination of JFK and the assassination of Martin Luther King. And the idea of, like, taking those elements out of history, there are a number of uncomfortable aspects of that. The most obvious one, the most immediate one, is the fact that these are real people who had families, and those families obviously now have to live with the fact that their loved ones are there. Like, I mean, there's the reality that, like, Jackie Kennedy was wearing that suit, and she had part of her husband's head on it, pretty much, and that's something that's horrible to think about, just in general on a human level. But also to know that, like, that was being recorded and documented, has been replayed and reconstructed and turned into art and taken and made into a story is very uncomfortable, and it is difficult to think about and difficult to process. And it's one of the things that's kind of just a general question about art in general and how you relate to that. Yeah. The reason why I might be more lenient towards Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man in this regard is because it doesn't feel so much like it's doing... it is obviously doing that. Before I was saying it doesn't feel so much like it is doing that, but it absolutely is doing that, to be clear. But it feels like it's commenting on a process that already exists. Yep. And again, this is the thing. It exists... This is what... Again, it's postmodern. And again, this is one of those things where if you're on the page with it, you'll go along with it. And if not, it will just drive you off the wall as something that's pretentious and self-aware. And it's sort of not really saying anything or disguising the fact that it's not saying anything by making all these clever hoity-toity references. And I can understand that aspect of it as well. But to me, like, it feels like it's commenting and playing on this idea of conspiracy theory, and particularly the way that conspiracy theory blurs the boundaries that exist between history and narrative. Because obviously the X-Files is a show about conspiracy theory. Like, we call it the mythology, but it's really the conspiracy. And it's this idea of characters who uncover the secret history of America that is fictionalized. And again, like, while the shooting of JFK and the shooting of Martin Luther King are particularly explicit examples with particularly unique individuals, I mean, is that inherently any worse than doing stuff like taking the syphilis experiment or taking concepts like the atomic bomb and kind of fictionalizing those and adding those to, like, the mythology of the X-Files as it stands? Is it this idea of, like, taking things that the show has already done? And it's not just the show. I mean, the entire counterculture conspiracy movement takes aspects of real life and sort of then works them and fictionalizes them as well. I mean, you could argue that stuff like Apocrypha and Piper Maru is playing on stuff like the Indianapolis, sort of that sort of thing, the dropping of the atomic bomb, and whether there's a line or a boundary of taste that exists there. So I don't think it's unique to this. What I think this is doing is very consciously and very overtly playing with this idea of what conspiracy is and how it fictionalizes history. And again, this is why I don't mind. I know you were very, like, I know that one of the reasons, again, you gave it an 8, so it's not as if you were railing on the episode, but I know that one of the things that made you uncomfortable, or one of the things that, like, Bad Carl, and I like Bad Carl, I like to imagine he wears a leather jacket and has sunglasses on, but Bad Carl was like, writers writing about writers is so passé. I feel like it fits because it provides a sense of context for this, because it's like, what a conspiracy theory does, and it ties back into this theme that we were talking about of extraordinary men, and the idea that Thomas Carlyle said about history being the biography of extraordinary men, which is not necessarily something that I personally believe. I think that history is a very complicated mess of things that happened, some of which resulted from, like, a choice made by an individual, but was that choice the result of the individual or his or her social conditions, factors, society, and also just, like, broader social forces. A butterfly flapping its wings in Tokyo causing hurricanes, across the world. That sort of stuff. And conspiracy theory takes these things, which are terrifying and frightening, and again, the things that this episode chooses, while they are a bit cliche and they're very familiar and they're very safe, I think that's why it chooses them, because it's easy to do that with them. So, like, the JFK assassination. The JFK assassination is terrifying. And again, I would speculate, and I think there's a number of other people who would sort of speculate along this line as well. But the reason why the JFK assassination kind of lingers in popular culture is because and being honest, I think it was the work of a lone gunman. But if it was the work of a lone gunman, that means that the President of the United States, who is nominally the most powerful person in the world, with the most advanced security detail in the world, with like all this protection, security, with this role that he had, a pomp and ceremony, was killed randomly by some guy sitting in a book depository with a rifle. And if that can happen, if the course of history can be changed by Lee Harvey Oswald with a gun in a book depository, then what meaning does anything have? What control can any of us exert over what's happening? If it's just one random person with a gun can take down what's nominally the leader of the free world, then how does this world make sense? And what we do is we tell stories, and we tell stories that make the world make sense, that offer a reason, a motivation, an explanation for it. And I really like that. Like, I feel like Musing the Cigarette Smoking Man does that with the JFK thing, and it's very overtly doing that because it's clear. Like, it's like Frohickey very literally takes the adaptation takes the Cigarette Smoking Man's life story from the versions the Cigarette Smoking Man himself is already fictionalized as a Jack Colquette sort of novel. So it's already a fictionalized version of the show's already fictionalized history. And so by that, I'm more comfortable with it than the question would imply, if that makes sense, while still being cognizant that it is an issue of taste. And it is something that pop culture does perhaps a little bit too readily and too eagerly in certain cases.
Yeah, I think in certain cases, I don't have a problem at all with this instance of it. But anyway, yeah, some good stuff in these sequences. So we get the meeting with Oswald and so on. And in terms of the assassination itself, that whole sequence is quite thrillingly put together, I think. I mean, obviously it's a fairly predetermined outcome. We know what's going to happen. But the episode uses a very effective instances of cross-cutting a number of times, actually, and especially in this sequence with the drinks machine and so on.
Yeah, I mean, if I remember correctly, Wong got nominated for a Best Director Emmy for his work here, didn't he? Which is remarkable for what is effectively his debut. I know he directed a couple of sequences, some second unit stuff on Space Above and Beyond, Dark Side of the Sun, including the hero shot. I think that was his first time behind the camera, but this is his first full episode of television as a director. And it's remarkable. It is incredibly well constructed. Mark Snow's score is also a huge part of why it works so well as well. Mm-hmm. I think you point out that you know the outcome, and I think that almost adds to the tension, because it's not a question of whether this thing is going to happen. It's a question of when and how, and the fact that there's nothing that can be done to stop this from happening. Which again ties into the episode's themes of like free will, determinism, fate, and the idea of like what power actually is. If somebody wielding power doesn't really have any choice, is that really power at all? Absolutely, and just another moment of sort of notable Wong direction that I like in this sequence is later when, so Oswald, he's stopped by police, he shoots the cop, he goes to the cinema where he's identified, struggles and is taken away, and then there's that overhead shot, isn't it, that sort of picks out the cigarette smoking man in the crowd who now lights a cigarette, of course. An act which ends this portion of the narrative. I think we briefly go back to the older CSM, because then we go to part 2 of the episode, which is just down the road a ways from Graceland. We hear Martin Luther King speaking on the radio, we hear typing, and I guess what's significant here, first of all, is the shift from colour to black and white, which is not the first instance of black and white in the X-Files, I don't think. But a notable one, nonetheless. It is indeed, and it's an entire act of an episode given over to it on a primetime television show in the 90s. Now, obviously, like later on, Postmodern Prometheus would do an entire episode in black and white with a Cher soundtrack. So this doesn't seem that impressive in hindsight. And also you have things like, modern television is much more adventurous because obviously you have cable with those providers as well. But it's still quite striking. And I remember watching it at the time and being like, this is very strange for television. And it kind of, again, it's one of those things where I could go either way. I can understand if you'd be like, well, there's, there's no real reason to do this aside from the fact that, this is about a white man killing a black guy. And, at one point, the cigarette-smoking man literally refers to it as it's not black and white.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I like that it gives it a rich atmosphere. It's worth noting as well that I think the earlier sequences in the 60s are somewhat hyper-saturated, particularly with light. And you can see it in the sequences. It's most obvious, for example, in the sequence during that briefing, where, there's moments where the characters almost seem to glow in the sunlight, which is very uncharacteristic of the X-Files, and to my eye kind of evokes that sense of hyper-saturated, kind of technical or almost early 60s film. And so I like this black and white element as well. And again, this is another level of again, the postmodern stuff, but it's this idea of fictionalized, compartmentalized. It's constantly reminding you as an audience member that you are watching something. That it's not it's not like somebody put a camera somewhere in the real world and is naturalistically observing it. This is an image that has been doctored in some way, and it's the result of a number of conscious artistic choices that it's going to draw your attention to at every opportunity. And so kind of creates a little barrier where you're you understand that this, not that you would ever think that this is real history, but that it's very consciously stylized history, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of what's going on in the narrative here, so the Cigarette Smoking Man has written a draft of Take a Chance, a Jack Colquitt adventure. He's evidently pleased, isn't he? I mean, we get this thing through the episode where, if he gets a pleasant moment, it's immediately undercut or vice versa, because he's kind of half listening to what King is saying on the radio, isn't he? He comments on communism being a comment on American democracy's failure. And he's like, oh no, why'd you have to say that? And then we go to the FBI meeting. So yeah, I think the first thing we realise very quickly is that just a few years on now, and the Smoking Man is evidently not the junior figure he was in Section 1. If indeed we are seeing, an accurate depiction of how he's how
he's advanced.
Yeah, but now we see him kind of referring to J. Edgar Hoover, for instance, as Edgar in quite a derisive tone of voice and stuff like that, don't we?
Yeah, and you've got enough plausible deniability to last you each of your 9 lives. Yeah. Basically telling Edgar to stay put for this. And there is something, and again, you have that wonderful contrast between this idea of a man who is nominally that powerful enough to tell J. Edgar Hoover, who, like most presidents, couldn't tell to stay in the room, and being able to hold him in his place, while also not having enough free will that it's that he can't stop killing King. At one point he says, I admire the man. I would vote for a King Spock ticket in a heartbeat. Which is, in hindsight, it feels like that wonderful riff on Get Out's. I would have voted for Obama a third time if I could. But there's a sense at this point that there is almost an honesty to it, that, he would vote for King if King were up for election. But, instead, circumstances have conspired that he has to shoot him. And you have this weird paradox again of this idea of somebody who's making these decisions nominally, or at least is enacting these decisions, that will change the course of history and shape the flow of history, but that they don't reflect his actual wants and desires, which is very strange. And again, it's worth noting, that comparison that exists, characters repeatedly over the course, first half of the episode, bringing up communism, because obviously it's set during the Cold War, but this paradox that runs through, and it's something that's very common in American culture, set in the 50s and the 60s, this idea of, conformity to American culture almost being, the thing that we hate about communism, that having to conform and not having self-expression or free will or not allowing the full expression of an individual's identity is what America was ideologically positioning itself in opposition to communism, as a champion of freedom and expression. But this paradox of at the same time insisting on conformity and social structures and this sort of very conservative buttoned down approach of how life should be, and sort of denying individual autonomy in a way, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I like that scene, like you say, the fact that he discusses his admiration for King, and the fact he has a somewhat rounded take on things. Anyway, so where do we go? We go to Memphis, don't we? Another lovely shot, I think, is the first shot of the street, and there were kind of paper bags rustling and so on. Again, very stylized, very nice. The personal and the political again. So we got King's speech on the soundtrack while Smoking Man looks at this picture of Mrs. Mulder and young Fox Mulder, I think. Again, the sequence, all this stuff about the assassination, it's very urgent, it's very throbbing, isn't it, in the build-up to King's shooting.
It is indeed, and you mentioned there this kind of parallel of like the personal and the political and stuff like that, and it absolutely is, and I think that's one of the things that makes the episode work really well, because again, we talked a little bit about like the broad political themes and this idea of the great man theory of history and the notion that like conspiracy theory allows you to believe that history is controlled. Like if something is the result of a conspiracy theory, then that means that the world isn't random, arbitrary, cruel. There are patterns that can be determined, rules can be followed, and the world makes sense. And like this is the paradox of conspiracy theory, where like while conspiracy theories are terrifying because they mean that your life is out of your control and is in the hands of some sort of sinister cabal that is maybe plotting to impregnate you with a giant alien monster that will burst out of your belly, it still means that there is a plan and there is a purpose and there is a way of making sense. And that somehow is more comforting than the idea that, again, worth noting in the context of this episode, although set primarily during the Cold War, and although, like, it does obviously play heavily into these themes of, like, capitalism and communism, it does that largely to suggest that there's maybe not as big a difference as all of the characters would want you to believe. I mean, there's even, like, the Colonel who, despite the fact he hates communism, is like, your father was an extraordinary man. Just like you are an extraordinary man. Yes, because he believed something. Yeah. It doesn't actually matter what he believed. He just believed in something, and that's what we're all about here. But, like, even though you have that, in the 90s, because you had the end of the Cold War, Fukuyama's idea of the end of history, and because you existed, I think, in what Philip Wagner describes, or Wagner, I apologize, I can't pronounce his name, it's Wegner, the life between two deaths, where it's that gap that exists between the fall of the Cold War wall and the collapse of the Twin Towers, where America was this, like, or what I think Krauthammer calls the unipolar moment. This idea where America existed, and there was nothing challenging it. So there was no way to define yourself in the way the characters define themselves here in opposition to communism, where it was just liberal democracy is. And you have this question then of like purpose and this question of like how society is ordered and how the world works. And the X-Files really tapped into that, and I think this episode really taps into it as well. But it also taps into something more personal and existential. And like you have that with the juxtaposition you pointed out of King's speech, which is this big, bold political statement about like America as a country and where it's going, with the image of the cigarette smoking man looking at the picture of Bill Mulder's family, which might be his own family or might just be the family that he longs to have but has denied himself. And you have that really personal idea that like even if you get past the idea of the country being out of control and spiraling out of control and nothing making sense, what about your own life? And does your own life make sense? Do you have control of your own set of circumstances? Which is a very personal theme, and it comes up again in Never Again in terms of Morgan and Wong's work, but it bubbles throughout the X-Files as well. And I really like the idea that the show works on, this episode in particular, works on those levels, where the cigarette smoking man is at once like this commentary on, this big grand pretentious commentary on history as a concept, but is also this tragic figure on a very human level.
Yeah, now, so if we zoom out a bit, and if the episode is doing all these things that you say it is, and I think it is, I think it is playing with all these things to do with conspiracy theory and conceptions of history and so on, is it too subtle? Or to put it another way, would a reasonable viewer watching this narrative perceive it on that level? Because like things like the line later on where Ferreri explains that everything he's just said is taken from a fictional story, for example, are quite fleeting moments. And it just makes me wonder, like, would the average viewer necessarily get from this episode the things that have been put into it, if that makes sense?
That's fair as well. And to be honest, there's a certain amount of sort of like, interpretation as well there. I mean, Morgan has talked himself about how, and again, we'll probably like talk about this if we want to talk about continuity and canon, but like Morgan's perspective is that like this is canon in the sense that this happened within the world of the X-Files, but it is also a commentary upon canon and a commentary upon conspiracy theory, which ironically is quite similar to canon because it's a way of imposing structure and order on an object or narrative. And like, so there is that aspect there, and I think it is there. Thing is, I don't necessarily think it matters if you do get all this stuff out, or if I'm just talking out my back end, so to speak. But like, I feel like the episode is structured well enough that it works either way, that even if you're just watching it as the story of a sad old man contemplating the life that he's led with absolutely no meaning to it, without having to, like, contemplate this idea of, like, well, is conspiracy theory an inherent part of the national character of America? Is it a representation of American exceptionalism? And this idea of providence and provenance, which runs through the entire kind of run of the X-Files, is, like, this idea of conspiracy theory a way of narrativizing the idea of, like, destiny as a national construct. Even if that stuff doesn't work for you, you still have a very sad story about a man whose life amounts to nothing, despite the fact that he's nominally one of the most important people in the world. And there's something... And again, it's weird saying this about the cigarette-smoking man, who in this episode murders, like, two really important and influential figures who profoundly affected the course of human history, and who does unspeakably horrific things over the course of the show. And, you know, you can take any sampling of cigarette-smoking man episodes you want for that, but taking him and making him a character that I personally feel sorry for, I imagine a lot of viewers do as well, feel a pang of pity for him. On a personal level, even beyond this idea of the huge swath of history that he sort of navigates.
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking was... So actually, I think William B. Davis discusses this in his memoir at times, which is feeling slightly uneasy when the X-Files attracted this following and wondering whether, for instance, it pushed forward a view that, you know, we don't necessarily need to heed what scientists say and things like that. So, like, I guess what I was thinking was... I don't think an average viewer would come away from this episode thinking they'd seen the inside story on the Kennedy assassination. But does it in some ways mean that...
Oh, you mean the broader conspiracy theory stuff, which is...
Perhaps,
this is... And again, this is one of the things where the X-Files is at once... And again, as a piece of 90s pop culture, increasingly prescient, but also increasingly uncomfortable. I think Ingu Kang wrote this wonderful piece for Vulture, and I made the citation wrong there on this, but she basically argued before the revival came back that, like, rewatching the X-Files in an era of, and again, you know, trutherism and birtherism, and, like, where conspiracy theories like Pizzagate have sort of gone mainstream as well, and where these things are just an accepted part of public discourse, there's this question of whether or not, like, the X-Files... And again, I don't think it literally did. I don't think that, like, the writers were sitting down and going, well, people are really going to think that, like, bees are being used to spread a virus that's going to turn you into an incubating alien creature. But that whether or not, like, the idea of, like, sending these ideas into the mainstream, and even in the fourth season, say things like the smallpox vaccine. Like, spreading the idea that the government is tracking you via the smallpox vaccine, and, like, propelling that to a larger audience than it would have had on, like, these crazy internet forums, or even on this old sort of, like, conspiracy zine sort of culture, whether that in some way contributed to... And I don't mean consciously, because you can't track these things.
Yeah, you can't prove it.
Yeah, you can't prove it. And I think you're entirely right that very few people would sit down and go, well, the smallpox vaccine is being used as part of an alien invasion, but contributing to a culture where people are like, yeah, I don't want to get a smallpox vaccine because, like, that means I'll be in a government database. And that makes me uncomfortable. And, you know, why shouldn't I question this? Why should I accept what scientists are telling me? And whether or not the X-Files sort of contributed to that culture. And it's worth noting several things. First of all, I would argue that, like, one of the interesting things about the fourth season as a whole is that you can see Carter and the writers kind of grappling with that, because this was around the time of the Oklahoma bombing. And you had this kind of, like, Timothy McVeigh, who famously, during his trial, I believe, broadcast, insisted on making the jury sit through a video going through the Waco tragedy, but insisting that it was a government hit job and that it was a conspiracy to cover that up. So you had this mainlining of conspiracy culture happening at the same time. And you can see and you had the militia movement, which was obviously growing as well in strength during the 90s. And you have the show getting uncomfortable with that in a number of respects. You can see it in Tunguska and Terma, for example, where you have, like, a militia that's, like, assembling fertilizer to build a bomb that are so scummy that even Krychek sells them out. But even things in, like, say, Unrequited, for example, where you have, like, this idea of a militia of forgotten men who are very angry at the government. But even, like, later on in the season with Gethsemane, which feels like, and again, Carter, I'll probably talk about it, if I'm doing that episode with Tony, I'll probably talk about it there, but Carter went to, like, an association of skeptics and, like, had a big talk where Richard Dawkins had, like, torn him a new one.
Yeah,
I think it was
right.
During this year as well, where Dawkins tore through the show for perpetuating, and for, like, normalizing this idea of, like, rejecting fact and history and like things that we know to be true in favor of like fanciful diversions, and like this idea of like, again, this is the postmodernism that we talk about. There's the and I apologize, I'm going to mangle the name. Is it Hannah Ardent? The writer who was sued by David Irving for naming him a Holocaust denial. She and various other Holocaust denial theorists have made convincing arguments. Again, this is very much down the rabbit hole. I apologize for listeners who were sort of expecting something more related to the episode. But this argument that happened in the 90s, I think it is very relevant to the episode, to be clear. I'll bring it back in a moment. But during the 90s, you had this emergence of, again, and we talked about the emergence of the militia movement in the States, but you also had like this emergence of like this normalization of Holocaust denial under the guise of like, well, I'm just asking questions, because obviously you had survivors of the Holocaust like slipping from memory. And again, the X-Files is very conscious of that. You have, I think, is it the character played by Floyd Westman,
Arbor Hosteen.
Hosteen talking about like somebody exists as long as the last person who remembers them. That sort of thing running through it. And you have the idea of the Holocaust passing from living memory as well, because all the survivors are going away. And you had things like, say, Spielberg trying to videotape the testimony of, like, Holocaust survivors, so you could preserve them even after the survivors had passed away, because there was this worry that once these things slipped out of living memory, they would become negotiable. They would become fungible. It would be possible to just ask questions in inverted commas. You would give people like David Irving a platform on which he could say, well, hey, look, if you look at the design of it, clearly this couldn't have processed as many, couldn't have killed as many Jewish people as they say it did. And I mean, Hitler didn't plan the final solution. To be clear, he did. And all those deaths happened. But you could have room where you had these Holocaust deniers coming in and, like, under the guise of, like, critical thinking, under the guise of postmodernism, could say that these ideas were suddenly up for debate and that we couldn't accept them. And there's a sense, watching the fourth season of The X-Files in particular, that Carter and his writers are very aware of this fact. Carter gave interviews, and again, this is around the time of Fight the Future. I think it was a German newspaper, possibly even Die Welt. But he was asked about, like, that. He was asked about, like, how he felt to be associated with that sort of conspiracy culture, that sort of, like, Holocaust denial culture, that militia culture. And Carter admitted, quite frankly, that he was horrified by it. Like, his argument was, he was never arguing that the government was injecting you with, like, tracking chips in your smallpox vaccine. Or that, the government was run by secret men who smoke cigarettes and are planning to colonize the planet with alien DNA. His argument was simply that you should question authority and think critically. And you can see that in the fourth season. Like, it's telling the fourth season builds to Mulder rejecting conspiracy theory. As like his arc over the fourth and fifth seasons, because you have this idea, and again, this is something that's interesting about conspiracy theory. And apologies, again, this may seem like another tangent, but I promise I will bring this back.
Go for it.
There's the AIDS scholar, the activist scholar Cindy Patton, who's talked about like the conspiracy theory that AIDS was invented by the US government and spread and weaponized and used against ethnic populations in the United States, which is obviously a conspiracy theory. It's not what actually happened. But Patton makes the point that, like, this narrative gets at truths that actually exist, which is this idea that, like, the government didn't invent AIDS. Absolutely did not. That's 100% untrue. But the conspiracy theory itself hints at, like, this idea that when this disease emerged in gay communities and in minority communities, there was no real initial push towards it. There was no real engagement with it. There was no real compassion shown towards it. That gay men and drug users were sort of neglected, and that it wasn't really identified as a serious threat until it started spreading to more conventional and photogenic sort of people. And that they were, and that Patton argues that while the conspiracy theories themselves are highly damaging, and while conspiracy theories undermine the fabric and social trust, there is a sense that as stories, if you look at them in a postmodern lens as stories, they hint at like truths that underlie it all. And there's this push and pull between the two within the X-Files in particular, and within Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man as well. And I think you're entirely right when you say that it's uncomfortable, because I think Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man gets away with it because it is so overtly fictionalized. Mm-hmm. And it's not just, you're right that the line is throwaway, where it's like, he's like, I read it in a magazine that I subscribe to. but like with even things like the use of black and white cinematography, the level of absurdity, because like there are points where this pushes into high camp, where it's like the cigarette smoking man is picking the winners of the Oscars, and Saddam Hussein is on line 2, for example. Yeah. That sort of stuff, where it's like it's heightened to a degree that it becomes kind of farcical and absurd. And so I kind of give it the benefit of the doubt there, but I think there is some truth in Ingu Kang's observation that like the X-Files is very uncomfortable when you watch it in a world where like you have things like Pizzagate happening, or you have things like birtherism or trutherism, or as a sort of political movements that have actual influence on the way people live. And you wonder to what extent shows like The X-Files and movies like JFK are maybe implicated in that. Not directly. I don't think Oliver Stone was setting out to make people think that, that was the case. But I don't think Carter either. I don't think Glenn Morgan was setting out to make people think that like there was a man smoking a cigarette who killed both Martin Luther King and JFK. But the extent to which they sort of normalize that discourse, and whether or not that's something that, and while I don't think it's their fault, does make it a little bit uncomfortable to watch them at the time. I do think, however, that Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man pushes into parody in a way that has aged rather well. In that, like, it feels like it's taking, like Gethsemane, like, takes that question seriously and says, well, okay, what happens if you strip out all the aliens and all the smallpox vaccines, and we just give you a montage of like the US government's history of like experimenting on people, and we give you just the facts, ma'am, and we take out the romance. Isn't that like, what would that be like? There's a sense that like Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man is almost like a push in the opposite direction, where it's like, what if we take this concept of a fictionalized history and just push it past breaking point? And I kind of forgive it for that, if that makes sense.
It does. I don't know, because, like you say, I think it is clearly absurd, and there are these scenes with comic moments that generate a comic effect and so on. I just wonder, because I'm aware of people who've, for example, sat down to watch season 2's Humbug, and because it comes off the back of all these other episodes, not been fully appreciative of the comic elements and so on. So I just wonder how many people who are familiar with, kind of passingly familiar with the X-Files, would have readily read that into this episode immediately. I think most would. I don't think everybody would. But I also don't think that's the fault of E.g. James Wong or Glenn Morgan.
Yeah, that's fair as well. And I mean, that's a question with things like this, is like, even if you, and again, you accept these things as things that are happening and things that you're concerned about, but there's an extent at which, at what point does an artist cease to be, not cease to be, but at what point can you hold an artist accountable for an interpretation of their work unless it's their stated intent, you know? I mean, you can obviously hold like Lenny Riefenstahl accountable for Triumph of the Will, if you want to invoke Godwin's Law on this podcast, but you can and obviously like, you can say, D.W. Griffiths and Birth of a Nation, there was very clearly intent there in what he was saying, but there's a point at which like, and again, this is our Rent would say basically that I'm using postmodernism to excuse this. But it's like, at what point does the death of the author, kind of, at what point do you blame the audience for the interpretation that they take from it, rather than the author for throwing an idea out there that the audience interprets? Not interprets, but interprets.
Yeah, I don't know, but let's depart from this subject just for a second. Let's go back to the episode. We'll get to part 3, don't we? We go past the King sequence, and then we're back with the older CSM. William B. Davis speaks, I believe it's after 27 minutes of the episode. So I just thought it was interesting that he had this problem with the script. It wasn't based on the fact that it was over halfway through that he actually spoke. It was the other stuff. Part 3 is entitled The Most Wonderful Time of the Year, and we hear the song of the same name. We're in Washington, D.C. It's the scene you referred to with Saddam Hussein on line 2. Time to call back, and this thing about the smoking man rigging, what is it? The Buffalo Bills can never win the Super Bowl.
Not while I'm alive.
Yeah, and you talked about the end of history, and we sort of are in the room when history ends, and Mikhail Gorbachev resigns, of course.
There's no more enemies.
Yeah, there's no more enemies, they say. And there's this discussion of the Spooky Kid and the X-Files. CSM will be in the basement, of course, in a moment. And, well, we should also mention that great moment where he gives the gifts to his men at Christmas. He's invited to this group get-together. He's evidently a lonely man. They all know it. He says no, and then they open their presents, and identical ties. And, funny stuff.
It's worth noting as well that actually this sort of gives you, again, there's this sense of like self-referentialness running through it. You have like the cigarette smoking man, right? And again, this is the thing where Bad Carl is like, shh, this is the worst stuff. But it's like you have cigarette smoking man sitting down while apparently puffing on a cigar and revving his motorbike, apparently, because I've now just constructed a backstory for Bad Carl. But like you have this sequence where like the cigarette smoking man is sitting down with a typewriter, writing about being alone in his apartment at Christmas while being alone in his apartment at Christmas. But you even have things like, this is an episode that is nominally a flashback episode, and you have the cigarette smoking man listening to tape recordings of like X-Files episodes, and you have the use of footage from earlier X-Files episodes, but you have this weird idea of the cigarette smoking man almost as a shipper within the X-Files, which is kind of weird, where he's like, sort of like, well, Mulder's probably lonely like I am, so let's assign Scully there as well, and let me just eavesdrop in on them. And you have this sort of like interesting kind of meta-textual thing. Worth noting as well, actually, that this is, I think that repeatedly over the course of the fourth season, they go back to the first season in interesting ways that feels very reflexive. And reflective. This is the first example of that. It happens again with Max later on in the season, Tempest Fugit, where Max comes back after having been entirely absent since the first season. And Blevins as well, obviously, the character comes back. He's reintroduced, I think, in the Gethsemane and Redux 1, Redux 2 three-parter as well. So you have this weird thing happening where the X-Files has been running long enough that, like, not only is it about history in the sense of being like American history that spans from the end of the Second World War, it's now reached a point where its own obsession with history covers its own internal history as well, which I find fascinating, just as, in terms of a side note.
Well, and that's kind of signposted by the fact that part 4, so we've gone from Dealey Plaza to just down the road from Graceland or whatever, and part 4 is actually called The X-Files of this episode, isn't it? Of course. Okay, so we get the meeting with Deep Throat, don't we?
I think you mean Ronald.
Ronald in a move which is kind of retrospectively, that is kind of made canon, isn't it? With
it is indeed with this I think,
that's
isn't
right.
it? With the gravestone. I love that. It's like, you can take this episode out of canon and try to take it away from me, but still we're coming back to
well,
this.
it's kind of like how Judi Dench is Pierce Brosnan's M and Daniel Craig's M, isn't it? But everything else is different. I guess it's kind of like that.
Yeah. I love that. The idea that, well, I mean, to be fair, if your main character, if your protagonist, if your author insert is called Jack Colquette, you're probably not great with names either. So it's probably like, it was just Ronald.
Deep Throat's call comes just after the Smoking Man starts this new story, isn't it, about being alone at Christmas and all this stuff about the crashed spacecraft. Deep Throat's concerned that other nation states will have operatives advancing on the US right now, so there's this supposed kind of lull in history that you kind of referred to, but Deep Throat is kind of vigilant anyway. And there's a nice conversation between the two, isn't there, or an interesting one at least, when they approach the alien. CSM's very reflective, gives this little speech about, how many events like this have we seen, etc. Of course,
just the two of us.
Yeah, the course of human history will be set once again by 2 unknown men or something. I suppose the sort of internal inconsistencies, or, he could just be lying, of course. The Smoking Man says he's never killed anybody. He didn't want to kill the alien. They have this coin toss. Deep Throat kills him. We get a cross-cutting again, don't we? Between Deep Throat and CSM, which, as we said, Wong kind of uses that technique repeatedly in this episode. So, yeah, what did you make of their exchange?
I mean, again, you point out the inconsistency of, like, the cigarette smoking man being like, well, I have never killed anybody, which is... you can read one of two ways. The most obvious one is that he's a liar, and that obviously fits with the kind of whole... And again, possibly, depending on how charitable you're feeling towards the episode, irritatingly postmodern acknowledgement that the entire thing might be a lie, and a series of lies bundled together. But it's also possible that you could read that in a more earnest way. Again, getting back to this idea of, like, free will and choice, and, like, the cigarette smoking man... The fact that he would argue that he has killed people only in service of his duty to government and his duty to, like, obligation. And so he never exercised his own will to kill anybody. He did simply what he was told, and therefore he doesn't see himself as having moral responsibility. Now, you could argue if that's the case, then surely it applies to this alien as well. If he were to go in and pull the trigger, he would also just be following orders and this sort of, like, protocol that had been laid down. So it's interesting to explore sort of that way as well. I do like seeing Jerry Harden back, though, which is good. And it's weird, like, because the sequence obviously, like, riffs on the story that Deep Throat tells Mulder back in EBE, but the details aren't entirely right either, because I think it was Hanoi, which he alludes to. He mentions Hanoi, when he's sort of like, when he's talking with the cigarette smoking man as they're going into the room. But it's kind of interesting that you have this, again, this internal inconsistency, and this isn't like the one with Apocrypha, where Morgan and Wong simply didn't know about it. Morgan and Wong both wrote EBE, and EBE is one of their kind of foundational texts, so to speak. It's kind of interesting that you have this kind of almost like distaff, this misremembered moment, this sort of like disconnected, kind of like, it evokes this story that Deep Throat's told Mulder, in that, and again, you have it right down to the alien sort of staring at him innocently, and Deep Throat seeming very kind of ashamed of what he's doing, but you have it sort of misplaced within the show's internal sense of history as well. And it's kind of, I like it, but I understand entirely. Again, this is one, I feel like I've said this a lot in this podcast.
Yeah,
I like it. I think it works. But I can also understand how it would really get your goat.
Yeah, well, I like it because the fact that, so let's say the event happened in season 1, and then the Smoking Man writes a story where he kind of aggrandizes his own role in it, perhaps. Then Ferreri gets hold of a story. So there's this kind of Chinese whispers thing where the story gets changed in the retelling, I think, is how I kind of take it, perhaps. Yeah. All right, so part 4, as we mentioned, is the X-Files. So Smoking Man observing Scully's meeting with Blevins and co from the pilot. Of course, he's in the room, but we see that again, and we see the CSM listening to Mulder and Scully's first meeting and so on. Then it's back to Frohickey and his kind of cod psychology. So the only person who can never escape him is himself, for instance.
Frohickey should write a Jack Colquette novel.
He should. We get this whole thing about the acceptance letter, don't we? And CSM's attempts to succeed, to get published, and so on. I mean, I love the way William B. Davis plays it, I think. You know, his kind of giddiness when he's on the phone to the publisher or whoever it is. That's fun to see, I think.
It is indeed. Can you, just to go back to that, obviously he gets the phone call where he's accepted, and that's fantastic. He's giddy, he's almost like a child. I love the rejection letter earlier in the episode, where, the camera pans across it, and, look, I've got my fair share of rejection letters, and they're not pleasant experiences, but I can't honestly say that a proper, letter-headed sort of, note from a publishing house has told me that, quote, the ending lame and the writing frankly crap. I can understand why the CSM is a bit burnt out if that's the case. But yeah, the sequence is great where he gets the call from Mr. Roth. And in particularly, there's the bit where Walden Roth tells him you'll have to relinquish some control. Yeah. Which again is that wonderful paradox where this is nominally the spectre of the 20th century. Every dark deed, the shadow of the popular history of America, between the end of the Second World War, or certainly the Kennedy administration, and the modern day, and he's here getting rejected as a writer and having to surrender his work to rewrites of the editor at Romana Clef. Yeah. And there's that wonderful sort of juxtaposition between the two extremes where again this is the personal and the political, the idea that we as a culture believing in conspiracy theories because they mean the world is controlled, but the paradox of even the people who are controlling the world, well then they probably have no control over their own lives either, which is kind of striking and works very well. And Davies is great, by the way.
Yeah,
Davies is great.
Absolutely. And it's just funny, I think. It always makes me laugh that he's so dedicated to, well, the fact that he has such strong opinions on things that he doesn't want to happen, like the Buffalo Bills winning the Super Bowl, but that he's also so dedicated to getting something published legitimately. You know, he could have, you'd assume he could have found a way to pull some strings to get his books out there, but he seems to be playing it pretty fair, doesn't he?
He does indeed, but I think that's the ego and the weakness of the man to a certain extent. Yeah. And I think that we all have those weird things where it's and again, it's that sort of sense of you could do a thing, but you want to do it a particular way because it means something to you if it happens that way. Even though, nominally it's ridiculous and stupid and silly and inefficient and makes absolutely no sense for anybody who's observing you or watching you do it. But because you're emotionally invested in it, it's it makes perfect sense. It's I'm not gonna hire somebody to, do these shelves, even though they do it in, 5 times as quickly and probably with fewer cuts, and it would look much nicer at the end. Point of principle, I'm putting up these shelves myself. That sort of thing, which I really like.
So yeah, he's resigning. He's resigning from the syndicate. Doesn't need it anymore. Doesn't need cigarettes anymore because he's going to get his book out, or get his story out, I should say. We see him at the newsstand, and I'm sure people know, but there's a Darren Morgan reference there, a nice little Easter egg on one of the magazine's covers, isn't there?
And I wonder if it's sort of reciprocated. Part of me wonders if, Darren Morgan was taking the sort of piss out of this episode when he wrote that sequence in not Jose Chung's Doomsday Defense in Millennium, where a character goes to a newsstand to read a short story and loses his mind. And part of me wonders if that was Darren Morgan having a bit of fun at his brother's expense here.
Ah, nice, yeah. Smoking Man is appalled, isn't he, by the tawdriness of the magazine. This isn't the ending I wrote, he says, and then that's a comment, of course, has a double meaning, or multiple meanings, in that it means something in relation to the narrative we're watching unfold, but there's also this out-of-universe explanation, isn't there, which we should probably touch on a bit more, of the fact that this was a controversial episode inside 1013, and that manifested in various ways, didn't it? And the ending, of course, is what CSM refers to here.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, the episode was internally, like it was a source of controversy. I think that Carter disavowed it and said that it wasn't canon. The title of the script, I think in Davies' memoir, he refers to it as being initially titled as the Memoirs, but was subsequently changed by the writers' rooms to Musings to suggest that they were less firm and less tangible and less real and therefore more abstract. But obviously the ending that caused so much controversy was the idea that Morgan wanted the episode to end with the cigarette-smoking man killing Frohickey. Yeah. Now, what's come out in the years since, actually, and it came out during interviews and press for the Lone Gunman TV show, was that it was Frank Spotnitz, John Shiban, and Vince Gilligan who apparently lobbied Carter to veto that decision, to insist that they couldn't actually kill off the characters. I think Spotnitz himself has said that he's not entirely sure that Morgan knew that at the time. But basically what happened was Morgan was told that he couldn't do it, and like this is remarkable. This is one of those things where you read it, and again, there's an article, I think it's a Dream Watch, but there's another one from Cine Fantastique, which goes into the mechanics of how this actually worked. And again, I'm speaking from memory and having read the articles relatively recently, but you should probably go and read them yourselves to get a full accounting of them. But as I understand it, what happened was Morgan was told that he couldn't do it. Braidwood was not entirely comfortable with it for understandable reasons. But what Morgan decided he was going to do was, if he couldn't get the setup and the time and the budget allocation to actually shoot Frohickey getting shot, what he'd do is he'd do something artistic that he could do in the edit, that sort of Wong could cut into the edit, which would be like a splash of blood on the wall or something to implicate that the headshot had been taken. And he actually shot this, and he took it down to the lab and had it developed at the lab. And when he came back, he discovered that somebody had actually removed it. The footage that he'd shot, that he was hoping that he might be able to edit into the dailies or to use as a preliminary sort of like, this is what it'll look like if we actually do this, had been taken away and had been sort of like snuck out from under his nose. And so as a result, Frohickey doesn't die in the episode. And this is interesting on a number of levels, because it gets back to, Again, bad Carl being like writers writing about writers. How passé. But I mean, this idea of authorship and control, and particularly how it relates to television. And again, we talked about this at the start with the X-Files being the work of multiple writers who contribute to it and stuff like that. And like with Morgan and Wong, who, at this stage are approaching the end of their association with at least this interpretation of the X-Files. Obviously they come back for the revival series later on, and they showrun Millennium in the following season. But like, Morgan and Wong had this huge impact on the X-Files mythology. Like, if you look at things like, for example, they wrote the first Monster of the Week episode, Squeeze. Toombs being, like, the archetypal X-Files Monster of the Week. It's telling that, like, the fourth season has Taliko, which is, Toombs again. That sort of thing going on. Neil Gaiman naming Toombs, I think, as possibly one of the scariest monsters of the 90s in popular culture. They gave us the character of Walter Skinner. They gave us the characters of the Lone Gunman. They did a lot to define the conspiracy in scripts like EBE, for example, but also even the second season pilot, like Little Green Men and stuff like that. And they codified a lot of what we expect of the show. They did a lot of work with the characters, Beyond the Sea obviously being a huge one in terms of defining Scully. Mm-hmm. So like a large part of what we associate with the X-Files came from Morgan and Wong, but there's this question of ownership, particularly when it comes to television writing, where it's like they created these characters, but then they left the show. And so these characters became the purview of other people. And it's telling that, like, despite the fact that they created the Lone Gunman, they did not show run the Lone Gunman. The Lone Gunman was run by Spotnitz, Shaban, and Gilligan. And there's this question that's kind of suggested by Morgan and Wong's desire to kill off Frohickey at the end of this episode. And knowing that this was going to be the second last episode that they wrote and produced, because as far as they were concerned, after the end of the 4th season, they're going to split off. They're going to do the Notorious 7, or just the 7, depending on which accounting you hear, which is going to be like a pilot that they hope to be picked up for series by Fox, which would be the story about, like, I think it was described as Michael Corleone goes to prison and becomes Mission Impossible, which sounds like something that I am all on board for, if we're entirely honest with. And they were sort of done with the show, and they wanted to kill off Frohickey, who they created, and there's this question of authorship and ownership. And I don't mean in like a legal sense, because obviously the character Frohickey, was part of the show and so belonged to Carter and 1013, and they could do what they wanted with them, and ultimately overruled Morgan's decision about trying to kill him off. But in terms of like ethically and creatively, this question of like, if they create the character, do they have any real ownership or control over him? And like, what's it like to take a character away from their author, or to say their author can't really do anything with it? And again, you have this paradox of like not having control as a writer, which I think is very clever. And you're right that like it's very indulgent and very like inside baseball. Definitely, it's very inside baseball. But I like this idea that even Morgan writing the script for this episode that is nominally about like being in total control of the world while having no control whatsoever, that he found himself in that situation where he's like, I created Frohickey. I literally brought him into this world, but I cannot take him out. And then having the cigarette smoking man also not taking him out as well at the end of the episode gives it that little sort of zest that I like, and I find interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I do find it interesting. Don't worry, my shadow self is in abeyance at the moment. Let's try and strip away the personalities though, and think about that decision in terms of what it does for the series, perhaps, because I am in the extreme. Well, I feel like I'm in the minority on this, in that I'd have been very interested to see how it would have gone if Frohickey had been killed, actually. I don't have a problem with how it does turn out. I think it works well in this episode. The Smoky Man says, I can kill you whenever I please, but not today, which is a line from his story, and so on. But I also slightly lament the fact, well, two things. One, I feel the series as a whole gets much more indulgent towards its supporting cast in later years. And I think the cigarette smoking man is probably the clearest example of that, as we all know, is kind of miraculous resurrections and so on.
I took a rocket to the face, but it only slowed me down.
Yeah, which contrasts, I think, with the early years when people like, let's say, Bill Mulder or Deep Throat or Melissa Scully, very fondly remembered characters who don't actually appear in a great deal of the series, really. I also lament slightly the way the lone gunmen develop, who, when they come on the scene in EBE, are quite an edgy, intense presence, and by the time the spin-off rolls around, they're kind of softened, aren't they?
Well, they're having slumber parties by season 5 sort of stuff. They're having like pajamas and breakfast.
Yeah, I don't know when the turn starts. I think it's gradual. I think they're still very compelling presences by the time of Unusual Suspects, for instance. But by the time you get to Free of a Kind, I'm less engaged personally. And I sort of regret that. And I wonder if Morgan had his way here, what would have happened differently?
I mean, being honest, my gut feeling, and again, this is the kind of thing where it's, where I say stuff on the internet, people get upset at me. But I'm like, hey, if Glenn Morgan wants to kill off this character and thinks he can do something interesting with him, let him try. Yeah. And, well, if he does, that's fantastic. And if he doesn't, well, we'll explore why that didn't work afterwards. Like, just sort of let the artist go do what he wants. Personally, though, this is the thing, like, I agree with a lot of what you said there, in particular about the idea of the show getting more precious with its supporting characters and turning the Lone Gunman. And again, I like the Lone Gunman a lot. Mm-hmm. The spin-off show is of variable quality, but I think there are like 3 really great episodes in there, which is, for 13 episodes in the first half of the season is not bad. It's not good, but it's not bad. But it's also, the thing is though, if you kill off Frohickey, that creates the question of what you do with Byers and Langley afterwards, because they're pretty much of a set. It's not like killing off, say, Bill Mulder, where you have Tina Mulder, who's hardly been sort of defined as a character, or even like, say, where you kill off X, and it's like, well, X, he didn't really have that many relationships outside of, it's not like we're gonna, what's the cigarette smoking man going to do now that X is dead? Question is, like, if you kill off Frohickey, what happens to Byers and Langley and what you do with that? And do you trust the show to develop that in interesting ways? Because it's worth noting the show hasn't done something like Unusual Suspects yet with the gang. Now, obviously, you've had little bits here and there. Yeah. Obviously, they were a huge part of stuff like Little Green Men, but they're also in like the sort of the wonderful ice skating sequence that they had in Apocrypha. but the show hasn't really given them like a focus episode. And so what happens when they fulfill the narrative function of being the guys who deliver exposition to Mulder, except now there's only two of them? And how do you deal with that within the scenes? Do you just have Langley and Byers pretend that nothing is unusual? Do you have them brought down every time that they're there? Do you have the absence of Frohickey discussed in every sequence in which they appear? I can understand the logistical challenges of that, like from the point of view of running a show week on week and having to write it. I mean, how would you? What do you think the impact would have been, like day to day, if you had killed Frohickey? How do you think things would have developed differently?
I wonder if Langley and Byers would have become more like Chuck Burke's presences, who are much less integral, aren't foregrounded as much, do have occasional fleeting appearances, are liked well enough, but they wouldn't have enjoyed the status that the triumvirate obviously does later on, is my suspicion anyway. I mean, the other, I just want to preempt what some of the listeners might say, because the other argument you hear is if Smoky Man had shot Frohickey, that would have implicitly validated Frohickey's story, and that would have been a mistake, because it's better to have an episode where it's ambiguous and so on. I don't think that's necessarily true, just because if you think about it from the Smoking Man's perspective, it could be quite useful to have Mulder and Scully investigating these dead ends, if that is what they are.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you could just have killed Frohickey, because Frohickey was kind of a little bit snippy about the prose.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Darren, so, I mean, we've chewed over this one thoroughly, but, are you willing to hear, are you ready to hear what our listeners thought of this episode?
The fact that you're asking me the question in that way, like, my body is ready. Should I be bracing myself, Carl? I feel like I should be bracing myself.
Well, let's see. We'll find out on the other side of this jingle. Well, Darren, the answer, I think, is actually a mixed response from the listeners for this one. In very interesting ways, actually, or at least I thought so. It was actually a bumper mailbag. I had over 130 messages about the episode, which is well up on what we normally get, because I think the conversation developed in some interesting ways. But it means I can't possibly read out everybody's response, but I've tried to pick out a range that's representative of the different points, the general points that came up. So let's see. So Andrew Levitt said, the Lone Gunman wouldn't have been the same without Frohickey in later seasons, but Musings would have been much more impactful if CSM had shot Frohickey. It would have kept in thematic tone with the rest of the episode and the character of CSM2. Yeah, well, I guess we kind of just chewed that over. Andrew went on to say, overall, it's an interesting episode, but it feels out of tune with the rest of the mythology at this point in the series. It also feels like CSM is a different character in this episode from the Carter Spotnitz version seen in most other episodes. Tony Black said, tremendous episode, often misunderstood.
Who's that guy again?
Yeah, Tony Black.
Frequent commenter?
Yeah. Frequent commenter, long-term listener.
Long-time listener.
Yeah. Tremendous episode, he said. Often misunderstood, I think. It's a quirky piece of apocrypha and internal myth-building. Only possible because of how iconic the Smoking Man had already become in the context of the series by this point. It's metafiction, essentially. Very self-aware about what it's doing in the context of the X-Files and the genre. Not necessary to consider this a piece of the myth arc as much as, in a broader sense, the myth of American culture and conspiracy across the 20th century. Easily one of the show's best episodes. So yeah, sounds like
I like Tony. You should have him on.
Sounds like you're in cahoots with Tony there. Yeah, good stuff. We're going to read a message from Tony again later, actually, but I'll leave that for now. That was his overall thoughts on the episode, though. Chandru Ravindran said, "Great compartmentalized episode that plays more like a spin-off than an actual episode. I enjoyed immensely, but don't consider it canon. William B. Davis and Chris Owens are phenomenal. Particularly love that moment when young CSM talks to himself mournfully after killing Martin Luther King." Yeah, that is an interesting spin-off. Well, I mean, in terms of spin-offs, but not spin-offs exactly, but there was a sequel of sorts of this in the Joe Harris comics, wasn't there, many years later?
There was, well, yeah. More Musings, I think, of a Cigarette Smoking Man as well, which is... Yeah.
Which also played around with, like, visual style and things.
Oh yeah, in terms of compared to the artistry, I think it was done by, was it Menton 3, the artist?
I believe so.
So it had this sort of like dreamy quality to it, which was really striking.
Ronald Wilson said, "The truth is out there. In Musings, it's way out there. By now, I get the sense that the narrative is a shifting combination of three POVs, the writers and Chris Carter, CSMs and the gunmans. No one would shoot you for a hickey, you're just a little puppy dog. Methinks if he had been shot at this point, it would have been a bit too far, barely 7 episodes after losing Mr. X. It did establish a threat, though, and maybe CSM could have shot 1 or 2 of the gunmen in a later season."
I love the idea of the CSM having them lined up and saying, you get to keep one of them, Mulder. It's like, which one do you love most?
In the end, though, Ronald says, I think CSM decided he had a weird, grudging respect for the lone gunmen, but he also knew they had a role to play in spreading ridiculous misinformation, as evidenced by Maurice Fletcher's reactions a few seasons later, despite that episode being a fantasy. So he's talking about the Dreamland two-part there, isn't he, I think? Yeah. Cortlan Waters Bartley said, this is not one of my favourite episodes. So, yeah, this is where the more mixed stuff comes in, I think. While I could appreciate the historical context of the cigarette-smoking man's life story as told by Frohickey, I always end the episode thinking, yes, but is any of it true? If we can call My Struggle Free a follow-up to Musings, since it's also about CSM's perspective, we know that the whole point is that he lies. Ultimately, this episode just never manages to expand my view or opinion of CSM as a character. And that's an interesting point, I think. I think Cathy, Glinski, elsewhere in the discussion, referred to it as it was something like a distraction rather than a clarification about this episode.
I mean, I think that's definitely true. I mean, it's worth noting that, again, the show has this awkward relationship with the Morgan and Wong episodes from season 4, where there's this sense of the other writers kind of being aware of them, but not necessarily, like, sure what to do with them. Like, you have, say, Never Again, you could argue, gets almost remade in the 6th season as Tithonus, for example. And you have the idea of the desk coming back. No, not Tithonus, apologies. Milagro, sorry. Apologies about that. But yeah, it has and you have even like in the 8th season, you have the idea of the desk that she gets for Doggett as a reflection that plays back to Never Again. Yeah. But you have this sort of like weird push and pull between it, where there's a lot of stuff where you can tell the writing staff are like, this is a good idea, like having Chris Owens around. And also, at the same time, being like, well, maybe not so much if we go that far, and kind of distancing themselves from it. And I think, yeah, there's, like, it is something that's very hard to fit in terms of continuity with everything else that you see, in particular the characterization of the Smoking Man. There's a point earlier on where it's like, yeah, this is not Chris Carter's version of the Cigarette Smoking Man. That's entirely fair. It's worth noting, again, the Cigarette Smoking Man's character changes dramatically depending on who's writing him, whether he's this character who is like impotent and pathetic, or like he is, like, say, in Paperclip, to pick an example, that sort of 3-parter that bridges the 2nd and 3rd season, where the Smoking Man is this sort of like almost pathetic, ridiculous figure, or later on where he becomes this almost like omnipotent Lucifer figure who takes the elevator up to go to work, to borrow a line from later in this season. Yeah. And like yeah, I completely understand it feeling like a distraction, particularly if you're looking, like, if you want a cohesive picture of the X-Files and of the Smoking Man. I do think that, though, to be fair to it, it does wear its influences on its sleeve, and it's very much, like, adamant that it is not giving you a coherent picture, even within this episode, let alone within the overall structure of the show.
Yeah, and what you say about the sort of shifting persona of the Smoking Man, I think Katie Doe touched on that a little bit, because she said, I go back and forth on this ep. In and of itself, it's an intriguing story, but I personally don't like that CSM is shown as being so involved in the deaths of JFK and Martin Luther King. Those are such huge historical events that it seems almost disrespectful to deal with them in a fictional way. I know X-Files involves other real historical events, World War II, etc., but they are dealt with not so directly. It's hard for me to explain. I love CSM saying I've watched presidents die in one breath, but not actually having it play out in Musings, even if it is through CSM's distorted view. I prefer it to stay somewhat ambiguous.
And I feel like, and again, this gets back to the whole, like, shifting persona thing, where it's having your cake and eating it, which, again, is infuriating. Yeah. I can understand why that would upset people, but this allows you to have a cigarette smoking man centric episode without revealing anything of, like, actual concrete value about the cigarette smoking man, which, you know, again, is something that you can take or leave depending on how sort of tolerant you are. It's worth noting, actually, Tony pointed out the idea of the cigarette smoking man as an icon within the show. Mm-hmm. The cigarette smoking man was an icon outside of the show. It's telling that he was the only X-Files character, apart from Mulder and Scully, to appear in the Springfield Files, to pick an example. But he also, I think he got a cover of, I don't know whether it was TV Guide or Entertainment Weekly. There were, like, articles that were comparing him, saying he was our generation's Darth Vader. And I think those came out even before he started hinting that he was Mulder's father, if you want to get that level of sort of detail.
And also, don't forget, Darren, the Bare Naked Ladies song, 1 Week. Do you remember that song?
I don't, actually. I'm not a Bare Naked Ladies fan, I have to admit.
Listeners will know what I mean, yeah. So, watching X-Files with no lights on, something. I hope the Smoking Man's in this one, yeah.
Ah, cool. I've heard the line watching X-Files. I've heard that line. I just haven't heard the spoken. Oh, ear for the spoken this one. But yeah, it gets, like, again, this is the idea of, like, this figure And again, this is the thing where it feels weird that this is an episode focusing on what is a nominally secondary character. But it almost makes sense to watch it outside the context of the show. Like, you could show this to people who have never watched The X-Files, or who haven't watched The X-Files religiously, and they will have enough of a coherent understanding of the framework of the show from the premise of the smoking man, that they'll be able to contextualize it and understand it. Which I think is fascinating, but which I understand is mildly frustrating if you are trying to contextualize it within the show, if that makes sense.
In a series which at other times is insistent on
continuity and the carry-on and a thread running through it.
Yeah. So I quoted there from Cortlan and Cathy, but let me just explain what happened, Darren, which is that earlier on, Tony Black had lobbed a conversational grenade into the discussion when I think the thread had been up for a few hours and it was only men who'd commented. So Tony said, I may absolutely be reading too much into this, so please guys correct me if so, but we haven't had one female comment yet on this thread. Is this a more popular episode with male than female X-Files fandom? If so, why? If not, do tell me if I'm talking out of my arse. Yeah, do you want to offer an initial response there? Are there these trends that we should look for? Or is it too simplistic? Or how do you feel?
This is the thing where there's always the push and pull between the two, where you don't want to be gender essentialist and you don't want to assume that you can stereotype based on how men and women react to media. And again, this is within the X-Files, this is particularly loaded because obviously you have stuff like shipping and no romos, and your stereotypical gendered approach to that would be to say, well, typically one would assume that men will be no romos and women will be shippers, and that's not fair at all because it's a much more diverse coalition of sort of people on all these sides of the thing. And I know women who are very ardently no romos, and I know men who are shippers and will ship Mulder and Scully until they die. And so while understanding that, it's also possible to accept that in terms of things I'm trying to think, is it Henry Jenkins' is it Fandom Poaching? I can't remember the name of the book.
I'm not sure.
But he basically he wrote this treatise about textual poachers. That's what it is called, textual poachers, about fandom. And basically he did argue that there are certain fandom activities that are gendered. And obviously there are exceptions that prove the rule. And it's a broad sweeping and it is a generalization. And we should be very careful about those. And, again, talking out my arse like Tony is. But he observed that there are certain things that maybe stereotypically masculine fandoms as opposed to stereotypically feminine fandoms And it's interesting in this regard because one of the things that Jenkins noted was that male fandoms are traditionally very fixated on continuity and very fixated on record keeping and very fixated on things like tracking and statistics and reducing information on a show down to data, whereas women were more interested in plot and character arc and theme. And I wonder, again, talking out my arse here and almost immediately regretting it as soon as the words escape my lips, but wondering if there's an element of that to this where it's this is a bonanza of stuff that happened and interesting pieces of facts, even though
except it doesn't
that's
fit.
to a certain extent the exact opposite of what the episode is, but therefore it might appeal to a more masculine fandom, as opposed to being, again, we talked about, you can't contextualize this in terms of, a character arc for the smoking man, or in terms of character motivation for him outside of this individual episode, and so maybe it doesn't work in that sense. But, willing to admit that I'm probably talking out of my arse here. So I'm happy to join Tony. What did actual women say on this?
Yeah, so I've just picked out a few comments. I mean, this conversation, it diverted away from Musings of Cigarette Smoking Man a little bit, I think. But Marlene Stemme said, and this is a longish one, but it's good stuff, as it usually is from Marlene. So
she's very good.
Katie Doe had come in and sort of made the point, someone had said shippers are typically female, and Katie Doe said, well, don't forget that there are female non-shippers like herself, as did Paige Schechter, I think. And Marlene said, I'm with Katie Doe as a female non-shipper. That said, the Mulder and Scully dynamic is extremely important to me. I also want a good story. The uniqueness of the X-Files is not just that Mulder is a believer and Scully a skeptic. Any stock characters could be shoehorned into those roles, but that the best stories or cases develop from the back and forth of their worldviews from their perspectives. David Duchovny said that what makes the X-Files different from other procedurals is the philosophical battle between Mulder's point of view and Scully's point of view. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Why would you want an X-File without Mulder and Scully? I'm sure there are other high-quality paranormal procedural or serialized shows out there. When Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man first aired, I didn't enjoy it because that was a week without Mulder and Scully thinking together to figure something out. Watching now, I like the direction and the cinematography is rich, but I don't think the story is worthwhile. A frustrated artist, manipulated by the government to commit various crimes, is rejected for the work he really wants to do and gives in to his darker inclinations. So what if this happens to be Cigarette Smoking Man? These aren't new angles. The jokes are cute and clever, but not anything that 100 other writers couldn't have easily invented. I just don't think it's great work, and I think Morgan and Wong, who are probably my favourite writers in terms of tone, have created much better stories. I would watch the episode again, but I don't hold it in high esteem as anything creative. I think not killing Ferreri was a wise correction. The idea to do so seems more like impulse and attitude rather than real risk-taking. The companion explanation of women liking Musings less because Mulder and Scully aren't in it would be that men tend to favour it because it seems fresh and bold, because Mulder and Scully aren't in it, and I just don't see that.
I don't think it's entirely unfair, actually. And I think there's a certain point, I think Marlene's actually quite right to observe that there is a tendency... And again, like, I co-host another podcast on called The 250, which is about the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time. And that is a list, and again, this is not me, like, it is me talking out my ass, but it's me talking out my ass with the benefit of statistics to back me up. Because everyone knows there are lies, damn lies in statistics. Mm-hmm. But the idea is the IMDb is a list that is demographically sort of dominated by male voters. And you can see that in terms of the art that is represented there. And again, it's not just male voters, it's male voters of a certain age. And you see a certain sensibility creeping into the films that make the list and the films that don't make the list. I mean, you could stereotypically point out that, like, there are very few romantic movies on there, very few romantic comedies on there. And there tends to be a lot more of what you would associate with movies that were important to men who came of age around about 1999, 2000. So, for example, Fight Club's on there very high. The Matrix is on there very high. And there's this whole sort of, like, American Beauty, weirdly enough, is on there very high as well. And there's this sort of, like, there is a lot of emphasis on science fiction, as opposed to, say, fantasy, which is traditionally coded as masculine rather than feminine. And there is that sort of aspect of, I think that, and maybe there is actually something, again, this is an episode that, and we talked about earlier in the episode, the difficulty, Poe's Law, the difficulty in, like, recognizing parody, because any really good parody just takes elements that already exist and push them so far out that to certain people they seem absurd. But if you're not looking at them, they can appear just like a heightened sense of, like, what it's parodying itself. And this aspect of it being a story about, and you're right, you were right, Bad Carl pointed it out, and Marlene pointed out, this is a story about a tortured artist who just can't be allowed to do what he wants to do, and how terrible that is, and how horrible it is. And there's a sense that he has to kill people. And you could argue, if you were very cynical, that if you were reading this episode literally, there is something in there that is, like, conventionally masculinely coded. It very much fits with that level of angst that you would see in things like, for example, Fight Club. Yeah. To pick an example, this, like, tortured, poor guy who, like, just wants to express himself, but also there's violence in there as well. And I can understand that criticism, and I think that maybe there is some merit to it. I think the episode has a lot more going on in it. I give it a bit more credit. And I think that, like, again, I feel like I'm revealing myself to be the stereotype that Marlene is criticizing there. The guy who's like, well, it's deep and profound, man. But it is to me, is what I would say. I think that it is to me, and I can understand, as I've stressed repeatedly over the podcast, that why it would not be to other people.
I'm going to give the last word to Cathy Glinski. Well, actually, Jeremy Daniels had an interesting point. I think that was reflective of the tentativeness of some of the male commenters in the thread, to be fair. And, yeah, as you kind of said as well, Darren. But he said, this issue is a bit of a minefield, but I think there's plenty of evidence that the vocal shipper fan base is mostly female, and their concerns are mostly with the relationship aspect of the show, which are traditionally understood to be feminine interests. There's nothing wrong with this, and of course it doesn't mean all women watch the show because of the relationship, and it doesn't mean it's exclusively biological or socially constructed. And then Jeremy said, and I'm now realising why this one's a minefield and could become a bit of a mess to sort through. That's all, he said. But, you know, I mean, in fairness, an honest attempt to sort of engage it and qualify it and so on, I thought.
It is, and well-intentioned. And again, I really hope that when people are listening to the crap that I came out with back there when you asked me that question, are similarly understanding as well. But, because, I mean, like, again, I'm cognizant of the fact that you can't generalize, and I'm cognizant of the fact on an individual level that you respond to the art that you respond to in a particular way that you respond to it. And at the same time, I also understand that there's a push and pull, and there are trends that exist that while you can't generalize from them, you also can't necessarily ignore. And so you have this kind of push and pull between the two and trying to figure out what's relevant and what's not, and what's worth discussing and what's not. And yeah, I understand. And it's actually, Tony, to be fair to him, lobbing the grenade in, it's a very valid grenade. And it's actually really good to have people like Marlene sort of there, sort of answering about it and sort of dealing with it.
To be fair, it generated some interesting stuff, and there was more interesting stuff that I haven't included just because I knew I wouldn't be able to include it all in this episode. But Cathy Glinski said, I appreciate this episode as a well-told story. It's not one of my favourites, though, because there isn't an X-File, and because there's very little Mulder and Scully. I don't know if that's a female perspective or just mine. I haven't done the research. But what I tend to enjoy about the show is watching Mulder and Scully work cases and confront injustices and uncover truths. We just don't get any of that in Musings. Also, whether it is fan service or not to kill Ferreri, as a fan, I'm glad they made that choice. All right, Darren. So I think we should call time on this one. Yeah, customarily we do the social media wrap-up. And for those who aren't familiar with your online presence, where can they find you?
Follow me online at Darren_Mooney. I co-host a couple of podcasts, including 250, which I alluded to earlier, which covers the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time. We do one movie a week. We typically have guests in. It's great fun. We discuss the movie in a great deal of depth. Also, I co-host a weekly podcast called The Scannon Podcast, which is an Irish film-based podcast in which we invite a bunch of very talented people from the Irish film sort of critical community to come in and talk about things like what they watched, the week in film news, the top 10 at the box office, and the new releases. So it's really good in terms of like introducing you to people who really know their stuff. Wide array of sort of discussions and material there, and just a whole bunch of talented people and me in a room together. So if you are interested, maybe check those out. I also write at the Movie Blog, which is just spelt with 0 instead of an O in movie. And I write there reviewing new releases, but also just random opinions that happen to come into my head. As you probably noticed listening to this podcast, I have a lot of very random ideas, and they tend to ooze out of my head randomly. But yeah, so that's where you can find me online.
Great stuff. Cheers, Darren. Always a pleasure to talk to you about X-Files or any subject, actually. And yeah, listeners, thanks for sticking with us. Feel free to get back in touch with us about any aspects of this wide-ranging discussion centred around Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. That's all for today, but always remember, deep throats, immortal words, trust no one.
The X-Cast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the X-Cast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an X-Cast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our X-Cast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.